This is video 3 of week 2, and it's our first of 2 videos on marriage practices. So let's start with the number of spouses. The first definition is of monogamy, which means marriage to one spouse at a time. Now, if we go back to the social evolutionists, we can see that monogamy was one of their main criteria for making it to the level of civilization. They believed that monogamy, in this Judeo-Christian sense, was superior to other forms of marriage that we'll be learning about. But many people, as a response to this, started to point out that we might, when it comes to practices in, let's say, contemporary America, serial monogamy might be a better term, because in fact, people might be mostly monogamous to one person at one time, but may have multiple monogamous relationships over the course of their lifetime. So maybe people say if you start thinking about serial monogamy, it doesn't really look too different from the second term we'll learn, which is polygamy. And that means marriage to more than one spouse at a time. More societies allow polygamy than don't in the world. So polygamy is not often practiced because it can be expensive to have more than one spouse. You really have to have a little bit of a financial foundation to make that work. But polygamy is allowed in more societies than it is not allowed. So we could even say that it's the prevailing practice in the world rather than monogamy. So a couple of terms for polygamy. First is polygyny, which means marriage of a man to more than one wife, and that is the much more common practice in the world than polyandry, which means marriage to more than one husband. Okay, now your Goldstein reading, which you may have already done, refers to a very specific type of polyandry, and that is fraternal polyandry, in which a woman is married to more than one man, and those men are brothers. Okay, this is a very rare practice in the world. It's only practiced, although in the article, which is a bit on the old side, and we'll talk about that, you'll see that it's practiced among Tibetans, a small Tibetan ethnic group that lives in one small corner of Nepal. Okay, so this map, the reason I chose this map, it's kind of a primitive looking map, but it's hard to find a map of China in which Tibet is not sort of put out as its own place, because of course China, from China's point of view, Tibet is an autonomous region of China, and from the point of view of many Tibetans, it should be an independent country, and there's a conflict over that. But anyway, since this is about a Tibetan ethnic group, I thought it was interesting to break that out. And this ethnic group just lives in this tiny little corner of Nepal. Okay. And just so you'll note, another reading that you have by Nanda about arranged marriage practices in India. Here's India. So we're talking about, a couple of societies that live close to each other in this part of the world. All right. So yes. So be looking for this example of fraternal polyandry, why it's practiced, by whom specifically in the society it's practiced, and what its economic and other kinds of benefits are. And then also think about why this practice might be changing. It's since the time of the writing of this article and today, it's decreased in practice. So think about why that might be. Okay, let's talk about the choice of spouses. And I want to just give you an example of one set of practices that can show us about the consciousness of choices of spouses in some societies. And that's a pair of practices called the sororit and the levirate. So in a sororit, a man marries the sister, so sororit, sorority, sister, or female family member of his deceased wife, and a levirate is the opposite. A woman marries the brother or male family member of her deceased husband. So the levirate is the much more common practice here, and it tends to take place in patrilineal societies. So think about it. Let's say there are two brothers, and one of them dies, and his widow is left behind. If his brother marries her, then everything in the patriline stays the same. She stays married within the same patriline. Her children are now raised by their paternal uncle instead of by some other man from another family line. The inheritance, the identity, the money, everything stays in place. Also, in many societies that are patrilineal, if a woman who is a widow is in a vulnerable position. So it's often seen as a kindness that a man would marry his brother's widow, take her in, take care of her, take care of her children, as a kind of tribute to his brother. But also it's meant to denote the fact that in a patrilineal situation, men are kind of interchangeable. You know, one man has the same place as his counterpart within the system, such as his brother. So for a widow to marry her husband's brother is kind of like being married to her husband in terms of where she fits into the structure. Okay, so this is one example of how societies might structure the choice of spouses. And as we can see, this choice is important because the sororate or the leveret can continue family connections and relationships in the event of a death. And so what I want you to note here is that in many marriage situations, I'd say in most marriage situations in societies across the world, marriage is not about what's best for the individual and who that individual loves and feels chemistry with and thinks is her soulmate and wants to spend the rest of her life with. Instead, marriage is about what's best for the family. And often that means what's best for the descent group. Okay? So we can see that clearly in the sororate and leveret.